and I'll talk to him.
Okay.
Well, hello everyone. As you're coming in, I want to welcome you and let you know that we are in the leveraging asset-based language for effective storytelling, and this is what the Johnson Center. This is Tamela Spicer as our speaker and presenter today, and she's phenomenal. If you wouldn't mind, as you're coming in, if you could please put your name and the organization that you're with. We'd love to see where everybody's coming from and have an opportunity to kind of meet you and things like that. We're going to use our chat function today. And if there's questions, if there's comments, if there's something you really like or you want some follow up on, let us know. And Tamela is awesome about taking questions. So she's going to help us do that today. And we're going to learn a lot. So we're really glad that you're here. This is kind of the home stretch for the conference. I know it's kind of hard to be on for 2 days and have all this immense learning that's going on, but we're just really delighted to have you. So if you get a chance, put your name and your organization in the chat. Yesterday I had a presenter who said, "Oh, and also put your superpower." I love that. You can opt to do that if you'd like. He said
Yeah.
his was teleportation, and I said, "Oh, that's a great one. Boy, would that make traveling very efficient." So
It
we're
would be
really
nice
glad
to
that you're
not deal with airports.
and not deal with airports. Exactly, exactly. That would be awesome. Yeah, yeah. I don't know how your luggage goes with you, but who knows? But I guess if you're saving so much on airline tickets, you just buy new stuff when you get to where you're going, right? Oh, goodness. So yeah, so welcome, welcome, welcome. And I'll go ahead and we'll turn it over in just a moment. We'll give people just a couple more minutes to get in. Yeah. Yeah, we'll just give everybody just a couple more minutes to get in just in case something went a little awry getting into the sessions. There we go. Hey, Deborah. Nice to see you. Oh, from Greater Bloomfield, Michigan week. Oh, awesome. I think you participated in one of our National Days of Service. I think it might have been maybe MLK Day. So we're glad to have you here. Really glad to have you here. Great. Well, wonderful. If you want to just continue to put your name in so we know that you're here, that'd be great. With that, I'll turn it over to Tamela, our awesome speaker for today.
All right. Thanks so much. I really appreciate being here. I know this is the end of the conference and it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon when everybody wants to nap. So I want you all to like stretch, do your Wonder Woman, your Superman pose in your chair, stretch your arms, do whatever you need to do to make sure you're awake and ready to go this afternoon because it can be hard at the end of the day after a long conference. I do understand that. So, just a quick introduction, a little bit about me. I'm a program manager at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. Most of my role is working with nonprofit organizations on capacity building, whether it's fund development assistance, whether it's helping them develop volunteer programs, strategy work, wide variety of work that I do with nonprofits, both as a individual consultant and also in training. So I've been at the center for about 6 years. I've been in the nonprofit sector for almost 30, which always makes me feel old when I say that. And I've had a wide variety of positions in the sector. So been a long time in this work that we call nonprofits. A little bit about the Johnson Center. If you are not familiar with the Johnson Center, we are located at Grand Valley State University in West Michigan. And our goal is to understand, strengthen, and advance philanthropy. And we do that because we really want to create strong, inclusive communities. We know that nonprofits are vital to community. We know that the world of philanthropy is vital to community. So when we think of philanthropy at the Johnson Center, we do think of the whole table of philanthropy. So it's both the nonprofits and the funders, government partnerships. It is the entire sector and ecosystem of philanthropy. So I'm going to give a shameless plug here and just let you know that we do provide a wide variety of very low cost training opportunities at the Johnson Center. There's just a few that are coming up. And we also have, I think we have them up listed through summer of next year. I know we're in the process of getting those done. So feel free to check out the website anytime for additional trainings. So just a few things, use your controls. Feel free to type in the chat box. I can't see your questions, but Melissa, I'm going to give her permission to go ahead and jump in when there's a great question. Feel free to ask them along the way. If you're like me, I forget them by the time we get to the end. Just a few things. I really want to encourage you to put comments in the chat box, to share questions along the way, and to be engaged as you are able. And just a note, sorry, we won't be sharing the slides. So take notes as you are able and as you so desire. So we already mentioned, and I think most of you have already put in the chat box, if you have not yet, sort of your name, your organization, and which community you are from. And I know we have people from across the state. I hope you're all enjoying good weather. It's a little cloudy here in West Michigan, but it's December. That's to be expected. So I want to talk today about asset-based language and how we can leverage it to tell great stories. I think one of the greatest skills we can develop in the nonprofit sector is to learn how to tell really great stories. And if we learn how to tell great stories, we're going to attract other people to our work. We're going to engage more volunteers. We're going to engage more donors. We're going to have a higher public prominence in the community, and people are going to be more aware of our work. But it starts with learning how to tell great stories. And all of us can learn to be great storytellers. It is a skill that can be developed. It is a skill that can be taught. And I think it's a necessary skill for everybody in an organization, not just the fund development person, or not just the volunteer manager, or not just the executive director. Everybody needs to learn how to tell great stories. So one of my favorite books about storytelling is a very little book. It is a tiny book, and it is also not a very thick book. So you can read it in an afternoon, and it's called Do Story. I believe there's a subtitle that is how to tell your story so the world listens. And it's written by Babette Buster. And this has been just a book that I have used many, many times. Mine is written all over and dog-eared and falling apart because I love this book. And these tips are from this book called Do Story. Strongly encourage you to buy it if you don't have it already. So when Babette thinks about telling a great story, one of the things that she encourages people to do is to think about telling a story to a friend. Feel like you're sitting across the table from someone, you're having a cup of tea, and you're just sharing a story with a friend. Years ago, a friend of mine from Kansas City took a journey on the El Camino De Santiago. I don't know if anybody's familiar with El Camino. It is I don't remember how many miles, it's around 500-mile journey, and you walk through Spain and little bits of other countries as you're taking the journey. And she wrote a book about her experience. And I remember when I was reading this book, I kept thinking, I feel like I'm sitting across the table from Perry and just having a cup of tea and listening to her. It was written in this very comfortable, casual language that I really just sort of settled into my chair and felt like I was sitting across the table from her. And so when we think about telling great stories, think about how you would tell a story to a friend. Whether you're writing a story for a website, whether you're putting together an appeal letter, whether you're putting together a packet to encourage volunteers in your organization, or sitting down and talking with someone. How would you do that in a way where you feel like you're talking to a friend? Make it personal. Create that connection. The other thing we want to think about is how do we set the GPS? So what do I mean by a GPS? When we think about the GPS, it's really what's the stage? Do I give people a sense of what the visual is? Do I create a space and a time so that they know the story takes place in a particular space in a particular time? That helps orient someone to the story. I don't know if you've ever watched maybe a television program or read a book where you didn't have a sense of timing and it felt really disorienting. Like, I don't know if 10 weeks have passed, if 5 years have passed, I'm not sure because they didn't set any GPS for me. So when we tell great stories to engage people, we don't want to create that feeling of being disoriented. We want them to feel comfortable. So we've got to set that GPS for people and let them know, where is the story taking place? What's the time frame? Are we in spring? Are we in summer? Are we in the winter? What is that space that we're in? And so when we think about telling really great stories, we also want to be sure that our stories are active. Sometimes you may have read something or heard something that feels really flat, but you can't quite figure out why. So, a great tip, if you're writing stories, you're putting them in writing. If you use Microsoft Word, you can go up to the upper right hand corner. There's a find feature that has a little magnifying glass. And if you type in ing, what it will do is it'll find every word in your document that ends in ing. And we know that if we tend to write a lot with words that end in ing, that means we're writing in a very passive voice. And passive voice can feel flat. It doesn't feel as engaging. It feels like there's no movement in a story. And so when we think about great storytelling, we want to avoid passive voice. We want to really use active verbs. We want to use more present tense. We can use a past tense, but we want to just make sure that it has some action to it. So, for example, instead of saying he was walking to the store, which can feel a little bit flat, we say he walked to the store. It's more direct, it's a little bit more active, and we minimize the word use in our stories. We don't want to add a whole bunch of words that don't move the story forward. So when we think about great stories, we always want to be mindful of the active verbs that we're using. And it's important when you're telling great stories to have some level of vulnerability, both personally as we connect to volunteers, to donors, to key stakeholders for our organizations. We need a little bit of personal vulnerability, and our organization needs to be a little bit vulnerable. So when we think about an organization being vulnerable, type in the chat box, what do you think that means for an organization to be vulnerable? I would love if Melissa could just kind of share some of the things that are in the chat box. And what does it mean for an organization to be vulnerable? How might we describe that?
I'd love to hear what people say. There's always that little delay, so it takes a moment.
Yeah.
But I think I can share something. I think, I've been with a few different organizations at different times in their existence and things that were happening. And some that really did well with this is that they were just very transparent and very
Mhm.
honest. If a mistake happened, they said, "You know what? We made a mistake."
Right.
Think that that builds so much more trust than trying to have an excuse for it. And I mean,
Absolutely.
it's kind of a turn off for me when I hear an excuse versus, "Hey, this was it. We're gonna work to do better. We're gonna work to be better." And
Yeah.
um and always something that shows their level of care and support for the people that they're serving,
Right.
the people that are serving the people that they're serving.
Right.
That kind of respect, I think, always needs to do that.
Mhm.
Frank said taking a risk. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah. A little bit of
yeah,
risk taking in that. Very much
yeah.
so.
They call that intelligent risk taking
Mhm.
to see where things
Mhm.
go. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
in that sense of vulnerability, yes, there's a little bit of risk taking. There's also that transparency, that honesty. It's okay as an organization to admit when you make a mistake. It's okay as an organization to say, we didn't get it right this time. And here's what we're doing to correct that. Here's what we're going to do to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. Because,
yeah,
as you pointed out, Melissa, those things build trust. So great stories have a sense of vulnerability. We've all heard or read or seen a story that feels too perfect, too prepackaged, and we can't resonate it. We can't connect. And so
yeah.
Great stories that engage people, that help build that connection, really require that sense of vulnerability. And great storytellers bring themselves to the story. When I teach fundraising or I teach board development, one of the things I really encourage executive directors to do is to make sure you're engaging your board in the mission, so that when they go out to tell a story, they can bring themselves to the story because they've had an experience. They've experienced a little bit of your organization. So whether you're cultivating volunteers, developing donors, engaging other stakeholders in the work that you do, if you bring that personal experience, a little bit of yourself to the story, then it makes a big difference when you're telling that to someone else because it feels more authentic. Your
Absolutely.
vulnerability shows up when you bring yourself. And so, even those of you who work as volunteer managers, think about recruiting volunteers. Have you ever had a volunteer experience yourself?
Mhm.
If you haven't, it's hard to connect with potentially some of the concerns that a volunteer may have, with different things that you can promote about why volunteering is great in your organization. So try to make sure you've had some experience of whatever it is you're telling the story of.
Yeah.
And that can be hard in some organizations to experience the mission. So you have to sometimes be creative to find ways to do that. But think about how you bring yourself to the story. Do you have something even in your life, even in your own experience, that has connects somehow to the organization that you're working with? And what can you bring of yourself to that story? And the key to great storytelling is you never want to tell the whole story at one time. You want to leave people wanting more. You want to engage people so that they will press in, so that they will lean in and ask questions and say, tell me more. We always want to make sure that our stories leave them wanting something. And we often want to be able to go back and tell another story, a new story, a different aspect of the story, because that's how we build relationships with donors, with volunteers, with key stakeholders.
There is something here from Anna that I love.
Yeah,
It says, "Be humble and willing to admit needs and mistakes, and then also take ownerships when things don't go well." Absolutely.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
very true. And that is so incredibly important to our organizations. It used to be that the nonprofit sector every year, and I can't think of the organization that does the trust indicator. It's not popping into my head right now, but there's an annual survey that kind of measures how people trust different institutions in our country. And nonprofits always were high trust organizations without question.
Hmm.
That's changed drastically over the last decade. And part of it is because we've seen scandal, we've seen things in the paper, we've seen not great things happen. And so
Yeah.
it's really important, if we want to build trust, to simply own those things and admit it when a mistake is made, admit it when something goes wrong. That's a vulnerability piece, right? Because that's going to help build deeper relationships.
And then,
So, yeah.
and I talked about, as I talked about that transparency,
Mhm.
Deborah also indicates vulnerability definitely means truth telling, which builds and sustains trust, builds and sustains trust. I think that's really critical too. Um,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and I wanted to add to this too that I find that people when they volunteer for a cause or they're attracted to something, but the reason why they stick with it is that they have a connection with someone. And
Mhm.
it's the volunteer leader, it's
Yep.
the people that they're closest to. You've helped them build those bridges
Right.
and make those connections, and that's how they stay, and then
Right.
they start telling the story, and that attracts
Mhm.
other people. I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
100% agree. And here's part of it too. How do we teach our volunteers to tell stories? We have to help people learn how to tell stories for our organization on behalf of our organization, because we want to make sure we create shared language so that when we talk about our mission and we're telling the story in the community, that we're doing it in a way that creates shared language, so we don't create confusion in the community. So there's some simple ways to help make that happen. And part of it is kind of thinking about our story foundations. When we talk about story and how we tell story, whether we're writing it, whether we're saying it to a person, whether it's in a video, whatever the case may be, we always want to consider, what do we want people to think? What do we want them to feel? And what do we want them to do? Every story should come with some sort of call to action. And so when we think about nonprofit organizations telling great stories, part of it is to always be mindful, what do I want people to think in this story? I might not be telling the entire story of an organization. Maybe I'm just telling one story of one volunteer experience. And what I want to do as part of that story is I want to help people understand why it matters. Why do you matter? Why am I telling you this story? And what difference does it make? And I also want to make sure that I'm myth busting when I tell a story. So, what do I want people to think about our organization? What do I want them to understand about our organization? Because here's the thing, if we don't tell people what to think about our organization, they're going to make it up. They're going to create their own story, and it may or may not be accurate. So we want to be really mindful about crafting stories in a way that are intentional to say, here's what I want someone to think about our organization. I want to myth bust any of those things that might be out in the community. Here's what I want someone to feel. I want to balance that emotion in a story, because we don't want them to be too angry or too sad or too, we want some balanced emotion. But we want to make sure that our storytelling evokes some sort of emotion. Why? That engages people, gets them excited, gets them interested, encourages them to some sort of action. Because that final piece of a story foundation is to think about, what do I want them to do? We should have some call to action, some focus of action in every story that we tell. It might be, I want them to volunteer. It might be, maybe I want them to help open a door for us so that we can go in and talk to their college group about volunteering. Maybe it's, I want them to open a door at their business so that we can engage in building partnership, not only for volunteers, but potentially for donors and other ways to engage people in our work. So always think about those three things when you're developing your story. What do I want people to think? What do I want them to feel? And what do I want them to do? And here's the thing, when we're telling great stories, there's tremendous power in the language that we choose to use. I mentioned that we want to feel like we're talking to a friend. So do we use really formal language? Do we use contractions? Sometimes when we write a formal letter, we feel like we can't say can't, right? Don't. We have to do not, or you cannot. But when we think about talking to our friends, we don't talk that way. We use contractions all the time. We tend to speak in short sentences. We tend to not necessarily have always the clearest path when it comes to the story we're telling, right? When we're thinking about the way we talk to friends, sometimes we bring up different ideas all at the same time. But there's tremendous power in the language that we use. And we want to be mindful of using language that honors the people that we work with, particularly if you are in an organization that deals with very vulnerable populations. So I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of work. And I want you to type in the chat box, what is the first thing that pops into your head when you see this mission? Our mission is to give voice to the voiceless. What does it make you feel? What do you think? What do you think of when you see this? I'll give you a second to type in the chat box. What are some of the things popping up?
I shared that it makes me think of an advocate, someone who is there to speak for others, to protect. Yeah, let's see what others have to say here. It's interesting how, that's Very powerful mission statement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Action, action, action. I love that.
Okay.
Amplifying minority voices when you have a platform that is louder when they're socially ignored.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Action, action, action. Yeah. Those are both great.
Yeah. Yeah. And so sometimes we can look at a statement like this and we think, yes, we're allowing people's voices to be heard. We're amplifying voices. But depending on which community you're in, some communities might look at this and say, wait, you're giving voice to a voiceless? Does that mean I don't have a voice inherently? And is that okay? So we have to be mindful of language that we're using because language is going to sit differently with different communities. So, what if we said something like, our mission is to amplify the voices in our community? Because that assumes that everybody already has a voice and we don't have to give them a voice. They already have one, but we want to help amplify it. So it feels different. And again, depending on which community we're sitting in, we may have different ways of looking at this. So when we think about giving voice to the voiceless versus amplifying voices that already are there in our community, does that feel different? So think about how that might feel different. I'll share another one with you. We provide youth with jobs in order to prevent them from committing crimes. What's the first thing that pops into your head when you see this? Y'all didn't know I was going to make you work so much this afternoon, did you?
Can you read that one again?
We provide youth with jobs in order to prevent them from committing crimes.
Oh,
What's an
yeah.
assumption that might be made when you read a statement like that?
Yeah, to me, it's kind of saying that youth are prone to crimes and youth are, um,
Right,
you know, left
right.
to their own devices, they're not gonna make good choices.
Yeah.
And then Anna says, assuming that kids without jobs are likely to be criminals. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's
Right. And
not
is that
really,
a message we want
accurate.
to give to people? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If
So
youth
we can
don't
look
work,
at
they
this.
commit crimes, which sounds stereotypical. Absolutely,
Mhm.
Frank, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, where are you coming up with these, Tamela? No, just kidding. But you're really provoking a lot of comments, yeah.
These are real mission statements.
Oh my
so,
goodness. Oh
so
my
when we
goodness.
read something like this, like part of us might go, "Oh, that's great. You're providing jobs to help prevent crime. That's cool. You're providing youth with jobs." But then when you start to unpack, it's like, "Oh, wait a minute. That doesn't feel right." Because we're making some assumptions, right? So what if we said something like, "Youth in our community are our future. We must invest in them as leaders." And what we do, like then you can go on to tell someone what we do in our organization is we provide jobs, right? Because we believe that they are our future, because we believe that we can invest in them as leaders, right? So it shifts the way that we think about the work. And so when we think about the language that we use, what are we saying about the audience that we serve? So when we think about using language that is strengths driven, asset based language instead of being deficit language. So when we think about that, we want to make sure that we're using really strengths driven language in all of our communication. We want to focus on experiences, not labels. We want to make
Absolutely.
sure that we're not putting a label on someone because of the language that we use, like that previous statement, right? Wait, are we assuming all youth are criminals? Because that's kind of what the statement said. We want to make sure that we're leading with shared values in our language. What is it that we value? That previous statement, it was like we give them jobs to prevent them from committing crimes. That didn't necessarily lead with the value that we value all the youth in our community and we see them as future leaders, right? We see them as the future of our community. We didn't lead with our values, we led with a concern, right? So think about how do we lead with our shared values? And how do we make sure that in our language, We're showing what's required to overcome systemic issues rather than blaming someone for a situation that they're in. So think about the language that we use that helps us identify and elevate these issues, these systemic issues that we need to overcome, versus in individuals' situation in labeling them because of that situation. And then emphasize collective responsibility. So that previous example that we shared, right? We believe that children are the future of our community. And because of that, right, we give them jobs. And so think about, what are you leading with? What's the message? What's the emotion that you're evoking for people in your language? So we want to emphasize that collective responsibility. So here's just a couple examples when these are common things that we talk about in our sector. When we think about deficit-based language, we talk about helping homeless people. We're seeing more and more of a shift now, or where people are talking about, we help people that are experiencing homelessness. Why? Because if I talk about a homeless person, I've labeled someone. I've said that they are homeless. It's an identity that I've given them. If I talk about someone experiencing homelessness, it's something that they are experiencing in their life. It doesn't define who they are. It doesn't label them. So we have to be mindful about the language that we're using. Another example is we think about a program called Step Up that helps girls sharpen problem-solving skills. Okay, that's okay. But how might we say that in a way that's a little more asset-based or a little more forward-thinking and values, leading with our values? We could say Step Up addresses barriers to success. So it's not about the individual. It's about the fact that there are barriers to someone's success, and we need to help them address those barriers. What about an organization that says we feed underprivileged children? Underprivileged used to be a really common term in the nonprofit sector, and we're seeing more and more people moving away from that, thank goodness. But when we think about we feed underprivileged children, what if you said we make sure that kids have access to nutritious food? So we're not labeling a child as underprivileged, because frankly, if they're living in a situation where they are experiencing poverty, that's not anything that they've done. That's just an experience that they're having. That doesn't say anything about who they are. And what about this one? We work with poor families. You know, it's so interesting I did this one time with my board. I used to run a social service agency, and most of the people that came into our doors were people experiencing some sort of financial crisis in their life, or people who were experiencing poverty for a lot of different reasons. And the language that our board often used and the language that our volunteers used, I would hear a lot of this. They would talk about poor in sort of a demeaning way. And I remember asking my board one time, I said, what do you think of when you think of the term poor? Like, what's the first thing that pops into your head? And I just wrote a whole list of everything that they said. And they were talking about, oh, people are uneducated, they're lazy. There's all of this baggage that they had attached to that word. And that's usually because of our experiences that we've had, right? So what if we said we work with families experiencing poverty? Again, we didn't label someone as being poor. We simply acknowledge that they have an experience in their life. And we need to step in to help with that experience. So when we think about the language that we use in our organizations, what does it say on our website about what we do? What do we say in our appeal letters? What do we say in our volunteer manual? How do we describe our work? So we have to be mindful and thoughtful about the language that we use in our organizations, because too often our language is a way of labeling people, and we create this us and them kind of an attitude in our work. And it's never us and them. It's always we. We're in this together. And one of the things we always want to remember in our organizations is that whatever service we're providing, that quote unquote gift that we offer, is equally as valued as the need that walks in our door meeting, right? So one is not more valued than the other. And so be really mindful of what's the language that we're using that maybe sets up an us and them, or are we using language that somehow puts a label on someone or defines someone? Are we using language that maybe creates a particular stereotype? So when we think about why does any of this matter? Well, it really does matter because if we're using asset based language, if we're using language that promotes a growth mindset, we're encouraging that growth mindset. We've shifted the way that people think about those that we serve in our organization. It's a culture question in many ways. We shift the way that we think about our work. We also know that using asset based language reinforces resilient behaviors. So if we are constantly talking to people in our organization about poor people, what are all the stereotypes that pop into people's head? What do they think? How do they feel when they come into your place and you say, oh, we work with poor people? Well, I don't know if I want to walk through your doors if I'm experiencing poverty and I've gone through a situation in my life where I need help because I don't want to be labeled as poor. So think about what are the labels that our language puts on people, and are we fostering and reinforcing resilient behavior in our language, or are we reinforcing stereotypes? So we don't want to label people. That's the key. So take a look at the language in your volunteer manuals. Look at the language on your website. Look at the language in your appeal letters that go out. Is it labeling people? How are we promoting empowerment for people that we work with? How are we encouraging that growth? And are we communicating hope in our language? Are we communicating solutions? Or are we labeling people? We also want to make sure that we're humanizing people. It is so easy when you're working in human services and social services and trying to resolve really complex social issues. It is so easy to fall into that trap of us and them language that is so dehumanizing. And it takes effort and intentionality and thoughtfulness to really shift to more asset based language. And it also takes practice. It's not going to always happen naturally because some of these things are ingrained in our culture. So we have to be mindful and thoughtful and intentional about doing these things because we don't want to reinforce stereotypes of people experiencing homelessness or experiencing poverty or experiencing mental health challenges, whatever the case may be, right? We want to make sure that in our language, we're assigning responsibility to the inequitable systems and not to an individual. Because the minute we assign it to an individual, we've dehumanized. And so we want to be mindful to elevate our language in a way that highlights and assigns responsibility to inequitable systems rather than an individual. So when we think about storytelling, there's a whole lot of noise. We are bombarded constantly with information, and it comes at us in all different ways. I sometimes marvel at our ability to even process everything that comes to us every day. So when we think about how do we rise above the noise, how do we elevate our story so that it's heard? One is to know your audience. Who are you talking to? We may have a wide variety of audiences that we communicate with as a nonprofit organization. The way we communicate with volunteers might look different than the way we communicate with a donor. The way that we communicate with our board might look different than the way that we communicate with our staff. So we have to understand who's the audience that we're telling the story to and focus on building community, creating a sense of belonging rather than us and them language. Really make sure that when you're figuring out where to tell stories, you're going to the people most impacted and asking them to engage and help you build stories, help you tell stories. Be authentic because that's what's going to build trust. And always think about what are the visuals that come with storytelling. Certain mediums are better for visuals. If you're using social media, research tells us that we're more likely to look at a story on social media if there is a visual attached to it. So, what are those compelling visuals that we're going to use? If we want to compel someone to volunteer and all of our visuals are really static, it might not look like a very engaging volunteer experience. So, think about what are those visuals. And by static, I don't mean a photograph. A photograph can be very active. If it's a good photograph showing people really doing something active. And always, always, always think about what is that shared, consistent language that you're using in your storytelling so that you're not creating brand confusion in the community. Because here's the thing, great storytelling can help you build charisma as an organization. We often think about individuals who are charismatic, but an organization can be charismatic. We can develop charisma as an organization. And what that does for us is charisma really is about social connection. Charisma is about how do we leverage our social capital. And so when we think about building charisma for our organization, it's about creating a network. It's about creating our connectivity throughout our community. And charisma, social network, is really built on trust. Charisma gives us influence as an organization. It opens doors. Charisma provides authority. We are seen as a leader in the community when we build a charismatic organization. And it creates this sense of belonging. Social capital is about trust and connection. And so charisma can also inspire action. So when we think about how we engage people in our organization, we want to make sure we're being mindful of building our charisma. And we can do that through great storytelling. So we've got just a couple minutes left. So I'd love it if you would type in the chat box, either if you have a great tip that you want to share or any lingering questions that you have that you would like answered. So I'll give you a moment to pop those in the chat box. So do we have any questions, Melissa?
Yeah, I was muted there. Sorry. Um, ah, so I was just gonna say I really appreciate this topic because it's all about connection, which to me is the most
Mhm.
important thing. As someone who, if you're running a nonprofit, you and your team, you have to be able to connect and be able to um, find a way to find common ground with those that you're serving, plus also
Right.
the people that are trying to help, whether they're volunteers, whether they're donors. And
Mhm.
Chris says, "Oh, anyway, we can get a copy of the slides." Oh, he says his never changed during the presentation.
Really?
Oh, that's
Hmm.
really strange. And
I hope
it is
everybody
the
didn't have that problem.
yeah, how about others? Did that happen? That's really weird. It did, I thought, at one point go back to that, but I thought I saw the other
Hmm.
slides. Hmm.
Okay. So any lingering questions?
We can hang out here for a few minutes for sure, just to get
Okay.
those questions out if you'd like to ask Tamela.
Yeah.
She's a great resource. We do want to say we do very much appreciate everyone being here, and hopefully we've all learned a little something. I think that I think that as you talk about not demonizing people, I
Mhm.
think, I'm very sensitive to that. Although, we all make that mistake. And when we hold each other kindly accountable, I think that's wonderful. And we all
Mhm.
have that opportunity to learn. Deborah says, thank you, Tamela. Great information that my grassroots organization will use immediately. I love that.
Yeah, and I'm going to actually pop into the chat box because I don't know if this is available anywhere. I'll type my email in there so that you have that. And again, this takes practice. I mean, I still, things will come out of my mouth and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was not like, that was not a value statement. That was not a good use of asset based language. And so it does take some practice, and we do need to practice the muscle all the time. So appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you this afternoon. Feel free to reach out if you have some additional questions, and hope to see you all. Hope we cross paths again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for being here. We're really appreciative. At this point, I'll go ahead and I'll stop the broadcast. So enjoy the rest of the conference. We have got a final wrap up session, I believe, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much.